Settle yourself now. Let your body find its rest. Your shoulders dropping, your hands growing soft and open, your breath slowing to the rhythm of something unhurried and ancient. Let the day release you the way a meadow releases the last warmth of afternoon. Slowly, gently, without resistance. Tonight we are going to a place that exists somewhere between the world you can see and the world you can only feel, between the sunlit earth and the quiet deep below it. We are going to follow the most beloved story of the ancient Greek world. A story about a daughter and a mother, about loss and transformation, about the way the earth itself holds its grief and then, eventually, chooses to bloom again. We are going to walk with Persephone. There was a time, the ancient Greeks believed, when the world was always warm. Not hot, not harsh, not the relentless blaze of a summer that forgets to rest, but warm in the way of a perfect afternoon in late spring, when the light is long and golden and the air smells of everything growing, when the wind moves through the grasses in slow, breathing waves, when even the shadows beneath the trees are not cool but merely dappled and gentle. This was the world as Demeter had made it. Demeter was among the oldest of the great Olympians, daughter of Cronus and Rhea, sister of Zeus and Poseidon and Hera, one of the foundational powers of the divine order. But where Zeus held the sky and Poseidon ruled the sea, Demeter had chosen the earth itself. The soil, the seed, the slow, patient, miraculous process by which a single grain placed in dark ground becomes a stalk, becomes an ear of wheat, becomes bread that sustains the life of every mortal creature who has ever drawn breath. She understood growth the way musicians understand music, not as an external process to be managed, but as something that lived inside her, inseparable from who she was. When she walked through a field, the grain bent toward her as naturally as it bent toward the sun. When she rested beneath a fruit tree in the heat of the afternoon, the tree seemed to sigh with comfort, its roots deepening, its fruit ripening on the branch. She wore her warmth openly. She was golden in the way that late summer grain is golden, a warmth that comes from inside, from deep growth, from the slow conversion of sun and water and earth into something that feeds the world. Her hair was the color of ripe wheat, her eyes the color of the soil after rain, dark and rich and full of the promise of things not yet grown. And in this world of eternal spring, Demeter had a daughter, Persephone. She was called, in those earliest days, by another name, Kore, the maiden, the girl, the one who was young and growing in the way that all the world around her was young and growing. She was her mother's great love. The thing that Demeter, for all her vast power and all her divine knowledge, could not have explained or anticipated, the depth and specificity of the love that a mother holds for a particular child. Not an abstract love for all growing things, but this one, this girl, this face, this laugh, this specific and irreplaceable presence in the world. Persephone Kore moved through the eternal spring of her mother's world with the ease of someone who has never known anything else, and therefore does not yet know how rare and precious what she has is. She was young in the way that the world was young, not naive. She was a goddess, and goddesses carry within them an awareness that goes beyond the experience of any single moment. But she was still becoming, still in the process of discovering the full dimensions of who she was. She moved through her days in a state of open curiosity, her attention catching on whatever was beautiful or interesting or strange, like sunlight catching on the surface of a moving stream. She loved flowers especially. This is how history has always remembered her, and it is the truest thing about her, the wildflowers that grew at the edges of her mother's grain fields, in the margins between the cultivated and the wild. Narcissus and hyacinth, crocus and violet, asphodel and lily, anemone and rose. She gathered them as she walked, pressing them between her palms, braiding them into crowns and garlands, filling her arms with color and scent as if trying to hold all of spring at once. The light in those days was extraordinary. The ancient Greeks tried to describe it in their poetry, in their painted ceramics, in the slant of their temple columns designed to catch it at particular angles. A light that was everywhere and even and golden, without the harsh peaks and deep shadows of summer or the cold horizontals of winter. A light that seemed to know what it was illuminating and to be glad of it. Into this light, Persephone would emerge each morning, her arms already reaching for the first flowers she could see, her laughter already just beginning in her throat, ready to find something worth laughing about. The nymphs came with her. As with Artemis before her in her sacred forests, Persephone moved through her spring world in the company of companions, daughters of Oceanus and daughters of rivers, young and bright and devoted. They waded together through streams still cold from the snowmelt of mountains that no longer had any snow. They plaited crowns from whatever bloomed closest. They fell asleep in the warm grass in the afternoons and woke to find more flowers had opened around them while they slept. This was the world. This was Persephone's beginning. Breathe it in. The warmth. The smell of rain on warm earth and the deeper smell of the earth itself. The sound of bees in the clover. The specific quality of that light going everywhere, finding everything, missing nothing. This was the world before the season changed. Before we follow Persephone into the story that would change everything, it is worth pausing in the warmth of what existed before. Worth understanding what Demeter had built and what it meant. In the oldest Greek myths, there is a time before Demeter taught humanity to farm. A time when people gathered what grew wild, moving through the world like any other animal, following the seasons, eating what each place and time provided, storing nothing, planning nothing beyond the next meal. It was not a bad life, but it was a hungry one. A life lived always at the edge of scarcity, always dependent on the unpredictable generosity of the untamed earth. Demeter changed that. She gave human beings grain. She showed them how to open the earth with a simple tool, how to press a seed into the furrow at the right depth and the right season, how to wait with patience while the mystery of growth did what it had always done underground, unseen. She showed them how to read the signs of the sky and the soil, when to plant and when to harvest, when to let the field rest and when to return to it renewed. This gift was not small. It was, in a very real sense, the gift of civilization itself. Because without the ability to grow food in a reliable, planned way, there is no surplus. And without surplus, there is no time to think beyond survival. There is no time for art or music or philosophy or the long, patient craft of storytelling that preserves wisdom across the centuries. Demeter's grain was the foundation beneath every great thing the human world would ever build. The ancient Greeks honored this deeply. They thanked her at every harvest, not perfunctorily, not as ritual obligation, but with genuine and awed gratitude, the way you might thank someone who once, in your moment of greatest need, gave you the thing that saved you. At the end of autumn, when the threshing was done and the grain stores were full, the first and finest portion was set aside. It was offered at her altar. It was burned so that its smoke rose into the sky where the gods could receive it. The altar was usually simple, a flat stone on a hillside above the grain fields, where the air was clean and the view stretched to the sea. A small fire, an offering of grain and honey cake and the first pressed olive oil of the season. A moment of standing in the cooling autumn air with the harvest smell all around, saying thank you for what the earth has given. Demeter received these offerings with the same warmth with which she gave her gifts. She was not a demanding goddess. She did not require elaborate ceremony or costly sacrifice. She required only acknowledgement, recognition of the thread between the divine generosity and the human life it sustained. She was, in essence, a mother, and what mothers ask for almost always is simply to be seen, to have the love that goes out in a constant and uncountable stream received and acknowledged. The world was fed, the world was warm, the fields were golden, and Demeter walked among them with her daughter at her side, and was content. Every story has a moment that everything pivots on, a single still point before which everything was one way and after which everything was another. The moment of Persephone's story, the pivot point, the before and after, was a meadow. It is called, in the ancient sources, the meadow of Nyssa. Its precise location was debated even in antiquity. Some said it was in Sicily, where the volcanic soil is extraordinarily rich and the wildflowers of spring grow in such profusion that walking through them feels like walking through a painting. Some said it was in Asia Minor, near the city of Eleusis. Some said it was nowhere on a map, which is its own kind of truth, a place that is real in the way that the most important places are real, not geographically but experientially. Picture it in whatever way lets it be most beautiful to you. A wide meadow, ringed on all sides by gentle hills covered in oak and plane trees, their leaves still the bright young green of the season's beginning. The meadow itself is an improbable abundance of wildflowers. Narcissus in great white drifts, hyacinth in blue and purple, crocus in saffron yellow, rose and violet and anemone. The air above the meadow moves with the sound of bees and the occasional low note of a wood pigeon somewhere in the trees on the hillside. The light is that afternoon light, still warm, still golden, still carrying in it the whole uncomplicated promise of the world before the evening comes. Persephone came to this meadow often. She and her nymphs, their arms already full of what they had gathered, drawn always a little further by whatever bloomed ahead of them, pulled along by beauty the way water is pulled by gravity. On this particular day, on the day that would change everything, the nymphs had spread out across the meadow. Their laughter came to Persephone from different directions, punctuated by the sound of running and the occasional splash from the small stream at the meadow's far edge. Persephone moved alone through the central part of the meadow, her hands trailing through the flowers at hip height, her face turned slightly upward toward the warm light. She was thinking of nothing, or thinking of everything that thinking of nothing really means, the free, wandering attention of a mind at rest, touching on the color of a flower here, the sound of a bee there, the particular softness of the air on her skin. And then she saw it. In the oldest and most powerful version of this story, told in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, one of the earliest and most beautiful pieces of Greek religious poetry, a single flower stopped Persephone. A narcissus, but not an ordinary narcissus. This one was extraordinary, enormous and impossibly sweet-scented, its white petals catching the light, its perfume so intense and particular that smelling it felt like a memory rather than a sensation, as if the scent was calling something from deep in the blood rather than simply entering through the nose. It had been placed there. The earth had brought it forth at the request of Zeus and at the design of Hades, who had asked his brother for permission to take the daughter of Demeter as his queen. The flower was, in the language of myth, a kind of doorway, a moment of such total arrest that the world could shift on its axis while the person at the flower's center stood transfixed. Persephone reached for it. She reached with both hands, bending toward the extraordinary bloom, her fingers just touching its stem, and the earth opened. This needs to be held gently, this moment, held without the alarm or the horror that more dramatic tellings have sometimes applied to it, because there is something in it that is more dream than catastrophe, more quiet shift than violent rupture. The earth, which had been solid and warm beneath Persephone's feet for all of her remembered life, simply opened, like a door that had always been there but had never been tried. A dark space, visible for just a moment, and then the rumble of wheels and the sound of horses, and a figure in a chariot rising from the deep earth, and then the meadow closing over what it had contained, and the flowers continuing to move in the light wind, and the sky the same blue it had been a moment before, and the bees in their busy orbits, and the stream at the meadow's far edge still making its small sounds over its stones. And Persephone gone. The nymphs, when they came looking for her, found only the meadow, the narcissus, the small impression in the soft ground where she had been standing. Nothing else. Let us follow Persephone now as she went down. The ancient Greeks imagined the underworld not as a place of fire and torment. That imagery belongs more to other traditions, other mythologies. The Greek underworld was something quite different. It was a place of shadows and quiet, a realm of the no longer living, where the souls of the dead resided in a state not of punishment or reward, necessarily, but of continuation, a different kind of existence, beneath the world of the sun. The rivers that ran through it were real in the Greek imagination. 5 rivers, each with its own nature. The Styx, the river of oath, dark and slow and inviolable, by which even the gods swore and could not break their word. The Lethe, the river of forgetting, whose water, when drunk, took from the dead the memories of their mortal lives, leaving them clean and new and unburdened. The Phlegethon, the river of fire, not burning but glowing warm, carrying its light through the dark like something living. The Acheron, the river of sorrow, its current steady and patient as grief itself. And the Cocytus, the river of lamentation, its voice a low, continuous murmur in the deep quiet. The underworld Persephone entered was vast beyond imagining. Its ceilings of stone were high as mountain arches. Its fields, the asphodel meadows, where the ordinary dead wandered in their quiet, gray-white drifts, stretched to horizons that were not quite visible. Its caverns held crystals the size of trees, glowing faintly with a light that had no single source, filling the underground air with a soft luminescence that was nothing like sunlight and yet not dark. And at the center of all of it, the palace of Hades. Hades himself is perhaps the most misunderstood figure in all of Greek mythology. In the popular imagination, particularly as it has been filtered through centuries of later traditions, he is often cast as a villain, dark, cold, malevolent, the god of death imagined as death's enemy. But this was not the Greek understanding. Not really. Not in the oldest and most considered tellings. Hades was powerful, certainly. Solemn, yes. He was not light or laughter. The underworld asked for a different quality of nature from its ruler, and Hades had it. He was steady, reliable in the way that the deep earth is reliable, never capricious, never given to storms or to sudden unpredictable change. What he decided for good reason and kept. What he promised, he fulfilled. He was also, underneath the gravity and the solemnity, lonely. The gods of Olympus had each other. They had the sunlit councils, the great festivals, the company of nymphs and mortals and one another. Hades had his realm, vast, magnificent in its own subterranean way, filled with the souls of all who had ever lived but not alive itself. The dead are not company in the way the living are. They are quieter, less present, more like memories of company than company itself. When Hades first saw Persephone, by what glimpse, in what moment of visibility between the worlds, the ancient sources do not fully agree. But they agree that what he felt was real and total. Not a minor attraction, not a passing fancy, but the kind of recognition that comes in the stories of gods and humans alike once. The kind that changes everything. He asked Zeus for permission. Zeus, who was Persephone's father, though he had not played much of a father's role in her life, granted it. Without, it must be said, consulting Demeter. This was not unusual in the ancient world's understanding of divine and human arrangements. It was, however, a decision that would cost the earth itself. But we are still with Persephone in her descent, still moving down through the dark toward the place that would become, in ways she could not yet know, her own. The chariot moved through caverns of extraordinary stone, through passages where the crystal grew in formations like frozen waterfalls, and the air was cool and carried a deep mineral scent, the smell of the earth's interior, ancient and clean, through spaces where the underworld's peculiar light gathered into something almost like dusk, that soft borderline between day and night, the color of the inside of a shell. Persephone, in the earliest part of her descent, called out. She called for her mother, and the sound of her voice moved through the caverns and the passages, absorbed by the stone and the deep air, finding no echo that came back to her. But even in that first calling, there is something worth noticing. The calling was real. The grief was real. And yet, there is in the ancient telling of this moment a quality that is not entirely lost. A quality almost of wonder, as if some part of Persephone, even in the disorientation of this moment, was also looking around at the extraordinary world she was moving through. Even as she called for her mother, even as the warm world above her receded. She was a goddess, and goddesses, even in their grief, contain multitudes. The chariot came to rest. The great halls of the underworld palace opened before her. And Hades descended from the chariot and turned to look at her, and she looked back at him. And whatever passed between them in that first long look is one of the things the ancient stories allow to remain private, as some things should. She had arrived. The world above would not be the same for a very long time. When Persephone did not come home that evening, Demeter knew. Not immediately, not in the very first moments of the girl's absence, which could have meant 100 harmless things. The afternoon light lasting a little longer than usual, a particularly beautiful path taken, a nymph with something interesting to show her. But as the light changed from gold to amber, and the amber deepened to rose, and the rose began to darken toward the violet of approaching night, and the first stars appeared in the eastern sky, and still the path from the meadow remained empty, then Demeter knew. She went to the meadow of Nyssa first. The wildflowers were there. The stream was there, still making its small sounds. The narcissus, that extraordinary, impossible narcissus, was there, still open, still releasing its uncanny sweetness into the cooling air. Everything was there in the meadow except the one thing that mattered. Demeter called her daughter's name. It moved across the meadow and into the trees and up the hillside and dispersed into the evening air and returned nothing. She called again and again. The nymphs came to her, gathered from their separate corners of the meadow, their faces carrying the particular mix of guilt and helplessness and sorrow that comes from having been present when something happened but not having been able to prevent it. They told her what they knew, which was almost nothing. They had heard something, perhaps, a sound, a cry very briefly, and then nothing. Demeter did not wail or fall to her knees in the tradition of theatrical grief. She was not that kind of goddess. Her sorrow was too large for those gestures, too fundamental. It went all the way down, the way the roots of old trees go all the way down, deep past the reach of ordinary expression. She lit her torches, 2 torches, 1 for each hand, and she set out across the world. For 9 days and 9 nights, she searched without stopping. She moved through Greece, through the river valleys and the mountain passes and the long coastlines where the sea came in quietly on smooth beaches. She moved without sleeping, without eating, without allowing herself the ordinary human comforts of rest and sustenance. The torches she carried, their light reflecting on her golden hair, and the tears she did not try to stop, illuminated the paths before her and the darkness on either side. She asked at every crossroads, at every village and city and farmstead she came to. She stopped and asked if anyone had seen her daughter. A young woman, beautiful, flowers in her hands, perhaps. Have you seen her? Have you seen a girl? The mortals she approached were awed and frightened and moved in equal measure. They could see she was divine. No ordinary woman moved like this, searched with this intensity, carried this quality of grief made enormous by a mortal scale. Some of them gave her hospitality. The story of the family of Celeus at Eleusis is one of the most tender in all of Greek mythology. An old woman named Iambe who made Demeter smile for the first time in her searching with a gentle joke. A grieving goddess sitting in a dark hall with an ordinary family who did not know who she was but offered her everything they had. She could not find what she was looking for. Not yet. On the 10th day, the sun god Helios, who sees everything from his high passage across the sky each day, told her the truth. Zeus had given permission. Hades had taken her daughter. Persephone was in the underworld. And Demeter, upon hearing this, made a decision. Not a dramatic decision, not a proclamation or a speech, simply a quiet, total, immovable decision. She would not work. She who sustained all growing things would sustain them no longer. Not until her daughter was returned. What happened next was something the world had never experienced before, and something that would leave an imprint so deep and total that even now, every year, the memory of it moves through the seasons. The grain stopped growing. It happened slowly at first, the way the light fades at the end of the season, incrementally, each day a little less, each morning a little more reluctant. The fields that had been green and full began to stand still. No new growth pushed up from the dark soil. The wheat that had been ripening on its stalks simply stopped, as if someone had paused a process midway, leaving it suspended in a state between ripe and dead. The flowers retreated. The meadows that had been carpets of color began to thin and brown at the edges. The fruit trees held their fruit too long, and then the fruit softened and dropped, not to the ground of its own ripeness, but simply because there was nothing left to hold it. Demeter walked through a world that was becoming, for the first time, cold. Not cold in the way of a cool morning that promises warmth later, cold in the deeper sense. The cold of absence, of withdrawal. The specific coldness of a world from which something essential has been removed and not replaced. The ancient Greeks understood this as cosmically as it was meant to be understood. This was not merely bad weather. This was a goddess in mourning, and the earth itself was mourning with her, because the earth and Demeter were not separate things. Her grief was the earth's grief. Her withdrawal was the earth's withdrawal. The cold that crept across the world was the cold of sorrow made literal, made atmospheric, made the temperature of the air. The mortals suffered first. This is the part of the myth that is easy to read as simply punitive, as if Demeter was holding humanity hostage in her grief. But this misreads the nature of what was happening. Demeter was not withholding abundance as a bargaining chip. She was simply absent. Her attention, which had always been on the growing world, turned entirely inward toward her loss. And the world, deprived of that attention, faltered the way any garden falters when the gardener stops coming. She wandered through the bare fields and the leafless orchards and the meadows where only the dead remains of last year's grasses stood, rattling in a wind that had taken on a new and edged quality. She walked through snow for the first time, that white and perfect covering that buried everything that had been, that lay across the landscape with an honesty about the depth of the current absence. Sometimes she sat at the edge of a field and put her hands flat on the frozen ground. And the ground knew her hands. And what moved between them in that moment, between the goddess and the earth she had given everything to, was something private and real and not entirely without comfort. A long patience, a knowing that this was not the end, not quite, even though it felt like the end. The cold deepened. The first snow became a season of snow. The grain stores of every village and city began to diminish. The mortals looked at their empty fields and their bare orchards and their flocks huddled against the cold, and they prayed. They prayed to Demeter, and they prayed to Zeus, and they prayed with the simple and genuine desperation of people who understand at last how utterly dependent they are on something they had always taken for granted. Zeus heard them. The gods of Olympus heard them, and everyone understood. Something had to be done. A world without Demeter's gift was a world that would not long remain a world at all. The negotiations began. While the world above grew cold and bare, we must return to Persephone, because her story during this period is not a story of passive waiting. It is not a story of a young woman sitting in the dark, counting the days until rescue. It is something far more interesting and far more truthful than that. It is the story of someone discovering who they are in a completely unexpected place. The palace of Hades was nothing like what she had expected, though in truth, she had not had time to form expectations before she arrived. It was vast, certainly, and quiet in a way that had no equivalent above ground. A quiet that was not merely the absence of sound but the presence of something, of depth, of age, of all the accumulated silence of all the years that had ever passed. But it was not without beauty. The walls of the palace were smooth stone, and in the stone ran veins of crystal that caught the underworld's soft light and held it in long luminous lines, as if the walls themselves were lit from within. The floors were polished obsidian, black and reflective, so that walking through the great halls felt like walking on the surface of a still lake. The ceiling above you exactly mirrored below your feet, and you moved through a doubled world, surrounded by infinite darkness perfectly reflected in the perfect dark. The gardens of the underworld were asphodel meadows, where the gray-white flowers moved in the still underground air with a motion that had no wind to explain it, as if the flowers themselves breathed. And at the edges of the gardens, where the asphodel gave way to the crystal formations that grew like trees from the cavern floor, there were pomegranate trees. The pomegranate trees of the underworld were unlike any fruit tree Persephone had known above ground. Their leaves were dark and glossy, their branches reaching into the low crystal light with a kind of deliberateness, and their fruit, deep red, almost burgundy. Their skins tightly packed over the seeds within, hung from the branches like lanterns, like the concentrated color of everything that had ever been red in the world, gathered and deepened and made more purely itself. Persephone did not eat. For the first days, she refused all food. This was instinct, perhaps, or knowledge, the ancient understanding that there are things you do not do in the underworld, rules of passage that, once violated, cannot be undone. She walked instead, through the great halls and the asphodel meadows, along the banks of the underground rivers, watching their dark currents carry their various burdens, the Styx's solemn weight, the Lethe's quiet forgetting, the Phlegethon's warm glow, toward whatever destination rivers in the deep earth moved toward. She began to meet the dead. This too was unexpected. She had known abstractly that the dead were here, but meeting them was different from knowing it. The shades that wandered the asphodel meadows were soft and indistinct, yes, their outlines not quite as definite as those of the living, their voices quieter, their faces carrying the particular quality of people who have put down a great weight and have not yet decided what to do without it. But they were real. They had names and memories and the remnants of personalities that showed through even in their diminished state. An old farmer who remembered the smell of the soil after rain and could describe it in loving detail. A young woman who had loved music and whose voice, even now, had a particular quality that made you feel the music she had loved even when she wasn't singing. Children who had never grown old enough to understand what they had lost, who wandered with a kind of uncomplicated grace through the asphodel, finding in it whatever children always managed to find. The interesting stone, the climbable surface, the corner that looked like a good place to sit. Persephone moved among them, and something began to shift inside her. She began to understand the underworld not as a prison but as a place of ultimate and democratic rest. Here, every living being that had ever existed eventually arrived. The kings and the shepherds, the poets and the plowmen, the mothers and the children and the old men who had lived so long their memories held entire worlds. Everyone came here eventually, and here they were received, contained, given the permanence that mortal life could never quite provide. There was a dignity in it she began to see, a gravity and a seriousness and a kind of profound importance. Someone had to hold this. Someone had to care for this vast community of the departed, to administer the complex business of souls, who went to the asphodel meadows, who to the Elysian fields of the blessed, who to the deeper judgment. Someone had to witness, constantly and without respite, the full accumulated weight of human life and human death. Hades did this, had always done it, would always do it, and somewhere in that understanding, something in Persephone began to recognize the particular greatness of the god who ruled this place. Not the greatness of power, not the greatness of the brilliant or the beautiful, but the greatness of steadiness, of willingness to hold what is hardest without flinching, of the deepest, quietest form of care. They talked. In the evenings of the underworld, which were not evenings as the surface understood them, but a deepening of the ambient light toward something even softer, a signal that the realm was settling toward its particular version of rest. They talked about the dead, about what it meant to care for them, about the nature of the world, which Hades had observed for longer than almost any being, from his unusual vantage of witnessing everything that lived eventually arrive before him, about Persephone's life above ground, the flowers she had gathered, the fields her mother had given the world, the quality of the morning light coming in off the sea on a clear day. He listened to her speak of it with the attention of someone who has forgotten what sunlight feels like and is grateful for the description. And she, without quite meaning to, began to find herself glad of someone who listened so completely. Hermes came at last, messenger of the gods, his winged sandals carrying him down through the earth strata at Zeus's command. The gods of Olympus had determined that Persephone must be returned to her mother. The world above could not sustain the absence of Demeter's gift any longer. Mortals were dying. The grain stores were gone. The fields lay bare under their snow. Spring had not come, and without some intervention it never would. Hades received the divine messenger with the composure that characterized everything about him. He had known this moment would come. He had not tried to prevent it, not through trickery or force, not in the ways that a smaller or more desperate nature might have attempted. What he had given Persephone was time, and whatever understanding had grown between them in that time. He went to her and told her she would return to the surface, to her mother, to the world of growing things and sunlight and wildflowers and all of what she had left behind. And Persephone. And here is where the story turns on something delicate and true and endlessly debated. Looked at him. Looked around at the underworld palace that had become, without her quite deciding it, familiar. And before she left, she accepted 6 pomegranate seeds from his hand and ate them. This moment has been interpreted many ways across the centuries. Some say she was tricked. Some say she was foolish. Some say she chose. And this last interpretation, that she chose knowingly to eat the seeds that would bind her to the underworld for a portion of every year, is perhaps the most interesting and perhaps the truest. Because think about who Persephone was becoming in the underworld. She had walked its halls. She had spoken with the dead. She had come to understand the enormous and solemn and necessary work that was done here. She had found, in the gravity and the quiet of this place, something that answered a part of herself she had not known existed. A depth, a seriousness, a capacity for witnessing that the eternal spring of her girlhood had never asked of her. She was not the same being who had reached for a narcissus in a sunlit meadow. And perhaps she ate the seeds because she understood, with the wisdom she had been quietly accumulating, that the underworld needed her, that the dead, in their gray-white wandering, needed the presence of someone who was also of the living world, someone who could be warmth in the dark, who could carry the memory of sunlight into a place that had none, who could make the transition between worlds less absolute, more bearable. Perhaps she ate the seeds because she knew she would be back, and she wanted it to be her choice. The pomegranate, dark red, its interior a galaxy of seeds packed together in their white membrane. Each seed a jewel, a world in miniature, bitter and sweet together, became the symbol of her dual nature, of her life divided between two realms, of the covenant she made, whether it was forced or chosen or something in between, with the world below. 6 seeds. 6 months in the underworld each year. The ancient Greeks could not agree on the exact division. Some said 3 months, some said 6, some said the ratio changed with each telling. But the structure was the same. She would return to her mother. She would bring the spring back with her. And when the season turned and the harvest was in and the world began its long lean toward cold, she would descend again. Half a goddess of the living world, half a queen of the dead, whole only in that division. The moment Persephone rose from the earth, Demeter knew. She was standing in a field, a bare, brown, winter-gray field, the soil hard under the unrelenting cold when she felt it, the specific vibration of her daughter moving upward through the earth toward the surface, like feeling a heartbeat return after a terrible silence, like a sound you didn't know you were waiting for finally arriving, and the relief of it being almost physical. She ran. In the mythology of ancient Greece, this is a rare image, a great Olympian goddess running. Not in battle, not in chase, but toward something. Running the way mothers run when they see the child they feared lost. Running with everything they have because the distance between here and there is the only thing in the universe that matters. Persephone emerged from the earth into winter light. And winter light turned, even as they embraced, into something else. The ancient Homeric hymn to Demeter describes what happened at their reunion with a restraint that somehow makes it more moving than any elaborate description could. They held each other, and Demeter asked, in the first moments before anything else, before the long conversations that followed, she asked, "Did you eat anything below? Did you take any food?" And Persephone told her about the seeds. And Demeter's joy became, in that moment, a joy held within a sorrow, and that complexity, that ache inside the gladness, is one of the most human things the Greek gods ever felt. But grief held within love is still love. And this was still, unmistakably, reunion. Around them, as they stood together in the bare field with the winter light on them, the earth began to move. It happened slowly, as real growing things happen slowly, but visibly, with a momentum that felt inevitable from the first green push of new growth through the cold soil. The grasses at their feet began, quietly, to green. The bare branches of the trees at the field's edge began to show the first cautious swellings of bud at their tips. From the south, from wherever warmth was stored in the earth's memory through all those frozen months, something began to move northward. A slow and irresistible wave of returning warmth, of soil softening, of seeds that had lain dormant in the cold deciding now was the time, and now, and now. The narcissus bloomed first. Of course it did. And then the crocus pushed up through the last remaining patches of snow with an audacity that has always been one of the most breathtaking things in the natural world. That tiny flower with its purple and yellow and white, pushing up through actual ice, insisting on itself, insisting on spring with a specificity and a cheerfulness that no amount of winter has ever managed to discourage. Then the hyacinth, sweet and deep blue. Then the anemone, its fragile petals a red so clear and true it looked painted. Then the great sweep of wildflowers across the meadows, moving like a wave of color from south to north, like the earth laughing again after a long, quiet time of keeping its feelings to itself. The world bloomed. The ancient Greeks experienced the return of spring as something miraculous, every single year. Not as a mechanical process, as if the cosmos were a clock winding through its predetermined motions, but as a gift, freshly given, as something that did not have to happen and could be taken away, and therefore should be received each year with the gratitude appropriate to a gift. The first flowers of spring in ancient Greece were greeted with a genuine and specific joy that we can still, if we are very quiet, feel an echo of when the first crocuses appear at the end of February, or when we notice the trees are budding, or when we wake one morning and the air outside has a quality it hasn't had for months. A softness, a faint green scent, a sense of the world opening its hands again. That joy is the memory of Persephone's return, carried in the body of the earth, expressed each year without fail as long as the earth turns. There was, in the ancient world, a ceremony so important and so widely attended and so carefully protected that it endured for nearly 2,000 years, surviving the rise and fall of empires, the transitions between cultures, the slow erosion of many other religious traditions. It was called the Eleusinian Mysteries, and at its heart was the story of Demeter and Persephone. The town of Eleusis, a small city west of Athens, connected to it by the Sacred Way, a road that wound through the hills and olive groves of Attica, was where Demeter had rested in her long searching, where the family of Celeus had given her shelter, where she had, in gratitude, established the first rites of her worship and taught the first practices of her grain gift to the Eleusinians. It became one of the most sacred sites in all of the ancient world. Each autumn, in the month the Athenians called Bodromion, roughly our September and October, the time when the grain was harvested and the earth began its turn toward the cold, an extraordinary gathering took place. People came to Athens and then walked the sacred way to Eleusis. They came from all over the Greek world and, eventually, from Rome and Egypt and Persia and every corner of the Mediterranean and beyond. Philosophers and kings, farmers and artisans, men and women, the young and the very old. The mysteries were open to almost anyone who spoke Greek and had not committed murder, a remarkably inclusive criterion by the standards of most ancient religious institutions. What was required was not wealth or status or philosophical sophistication. What was required was willingness. Willingness to participate, to be changed. The initiation process took place over several days. It began with purification. Initiates bathed in the sea, a washing that was understood as something internal as much as external, a preparation of the self for something significant. There were sacrifices and offerings, formal rituals carried out by the priests of Demeter and Persephone, and the carrying of sacred objects in covered baskets, their contents hidden from the uninitiated. The procession to Eleusis along the sacred way was itself part of the rite, the walking of that ancient road, lined with shrines and votive offerings left by generations of previous initiates, the shared movement of thousands of people through the landscape of Attica in the particular light of the autumn afternoon, the harvest smell in the air, the first leaves beginning to turn on the plane trees along the road. And then, at Eleusis, in the great hall called the Telesterion, the hall of initiation, large enough to hold thousands of initiates seated on its stepped stone benches, something happened. What happened, we do not entirely know. This is the extraordinary fact at the center of the Eleusinian mysteries. They were secret. The initiates, hundreds of thousands of them over the 2,000 years of the rites practice, kept the secret. Almost perfectly, almost entirely. The penalty for revelation was severe, and beyond the legal deterrent, there seems to have been a genuine reverence, a sense that what had happened in the Telesterion was something that could not, and perhaps should not, be translated into words for the uninitiated. What we know from fragments and oblique references is this: there was a dramatic reenactment of some kind. Something was shown, something was said, and whatever it was, the experience of that night in the Telesterion, with the torches and the sacred objects and the culminating vision, was understood to change the initiates permanently. Not to make them happy exactly, but to remove from them the fear of death. The philosopher Cicero, writing centuries after his own initiation, said of the mysteries only this: that they had given him the ability to live with joy and the ability to face death with hope. The story they were enacting in that torchlit hall was the story of Persephone, her descent and her return, the search of Demeter through the bare winter world, the reunion that brought the spring, and something beyond that, something in the experience of witnessing or participating in that story that opened a door in the initiate's understanding of their own death. Because the message at the heart of the Persephone myth, understood fully, is this: descent is not an ending. Loss is not final. The thing that goes down into the dark does not stay there. Comes back transformed, but it comes back. The seed goes into the ground in autumn, into the cold and the dark. And in spring it returns, as something greater, as something that can feed the world. This is the mystery, simple and enormous. The initiate stood in the telesterion and experienced it, in whatever form the priests gave it, and came out knowing it not as a philosophical proposition but as a felt truth, carried in the body. They walked home in the morning light, back along the sacred way, through the olive groves and the stone-walled fields, and they were different people than they had been the morning before. The Eleusinian mysteries were the great and formal expression of devotion to Demeter and Persephone. But the worship of these goddesses was also everywhere else, in the daily and seasonal rhythms of agricultural life, in the ordinary rituals of ordinary people whose lives were structured by the grain and the harvest and the turning year. The Thesmophoria was perhaps the most widely practiced festival in ancient Greece. A women's festival held each autumn, around the time of the sowing of the new grain, in honor of Demeter and her daughter. It was celebrated in city after city, village after village, across the entire Greek world, for centuries. For 3 days in autumn, women gathered separately from men and performed the rituals of the festival in spaces that had been consecrated for the purpose. They sat on the ground, on leafy branches, on the bare earth, in a deliberate simplicity that recalled Demeter's own grief, her wandering, her sitting on the joyless stone at the well in Eleusis. They fasted, they brought offerings, they performed ceremonies whose details were theirs to keep. The Thesmophoria was understood as foundational to the fertility of the fields, not magically, not mechanically, but in the sense that the relationship between humanity and the divine powers of the earth needed to be tended like any relationship. It needed acknowledgement, tension, the willingness to participate in the rhythms it established rather than simply extracting what it offered. In the fields themselves, the worship was practical and daily. Demeter and Persephone were present at the plowing and the sowing, at the long patient waiting of the growing months, at the dramatic labor of harvest. Small offerings were made at the field's edge, a portion of grain left for the mice and the birds, understood as belonging to the earth's own creatures, as a kind of tithe. The last sheaf of wheat was cut with a particular ceremony, bound in a particular way, kept in the farmhouse through the winter as a symbol of the return that was promised. For Persephone specifically, the arrival of spring was marked with the kind of joy that the body expresses before the mind has organized it into ceremony. People went out into the meadows and gathered the first flowers. Young women braided them into their hair. The spring festivals, the Anthesteria, the Thargelia, were full of this quality of embodied, slightly surprised delight. As if every year spring was faintly miraculous. As if Persephone's return was never quite taken for granted. And in private homes, women kept small shrines to these goddesses. A shelf in the kitchen, perhaps, where a clay figure of Demeter stood beside a small lamp that was lit at mealtimes. A handful of grain in a terracotta bowl. A spray of whatever was blooming, changed weekly, keeping the space alive with the same principle the goddess embodied. These were not superstitions. They were the expression of a genuine and sophisticated understanding that the forces which sustained life were not impersonal mechanisms but real presences, deserving of the same attention and gratitude you would give to anything or anyone that loved you and fed you and made your life possible. There is something in that understanding that is worth considering, even now, the deep acknowledgement of dependence, the willingness to say thank you to the earth, the recognition that the turning of seasons is not a background event but a primary story, the primary story, the one that contains all other stories within it. Let us step back from the rituals and the worship and the historical practice and return to the goddess herself, to who Persephone became. There is a version of the Persephone myth that ends with her return to the surface, that understands her annual descent as purely a loss, as something done to her rather than something she became. This version keeps her permanently as Kore, the maiden, the girl who was taken and then returned and then taken again, victim of a story she did not choose. But the ancient Greeks, in their deeper and more considered tellings, knew something different about her. By the time of the classical period, Persephone was worshipped not only as the daughter but as the queen. As the sovereign of the underworld, co-ruler beside Hades, exercising an authority that was real and recognized. She received the prayers of mortals who wished to communicate with the dead. She presided over the judgment of souls alongside her husband. She was petitioned by heroes who descended to the underworld seeking something. A loved one returned, knowledge of the future, the completion of an impossible task, and she it was who heard them and decided. When Orpheus descended to the underworld in the greatest of all love stories, playing his lyre as he walked the dark corridors, his music so beautiful that even the shades wept and even the rivers paused to listen, it was Hades and Persephone together who gave him his answer. And in some tellings, it was Persephone's mercy that made the decision possible. Her willingness to be moved by what was beautiful and true and desperate. She was not only mercy, she was also justice, the absolute democratic justice of death, which takes everyone equally and judges by its own ancient criteria. She was the goddess of those oaths taken in the underworld, which were inviolable because the underworld itself was inviolable, beyond the reach of the manipulations and powers of the upper world. But she carried something that no other underworld deity possessed. The living world within her, the memory of meadows, the knowledge of what sunlight felt like on skin, the held experience of spring, carried through the dark months in the underworld like a lamp carried against a wind, sheltered and maintained, not extinguished. And this made her something no one else in the underworld could be: a bridge. She was the crossing point, the goddess of the threshold between living and dead, between the world above and the world below, between the Persephone who walked in spring meadows and the Persephone who presided in the underworld palace. Both were entirely real. Both were entirely her. The Greeks understood her transformation not as tragedy but as the deepest kind of education. The girl who gathered flowers became the queen who held the souls of the world. The maiden who had never known winter became the woman who was winter's deepest truth. That it ends. That under the cold and the bare branches and the frozen ground, something is gathering itself, waiting, becoming ready. She is the knowledge that spring holds within itself all winter, the whole dark underground journey, and still returns. Every year, the story plays itself out. In autumn, when the light begins to fail earlier each evening and the air takes on that first crisp edge, something shifts in the quality of the world. The leaves are turning, the oaks first, their leaves going from summer green to amber to the deep red brown of old copper, falling in slow spirals through the still air of October afternoons. The orchards are full of the last of the fruit, heavy and ripe and almost past their moment. The grain has been harvested and stored. The fields lie bare and resting. This is Persephone descending, slowly, not all at once, but with the gathering inevitability of the season. Moving down through the layers of the earth toward the quiet hall and the crystal caverns and the solemn husband who has been waiting all the long warm months of her absence. The world above begins its lean toward dark. In winter, the earth keeps its secrets underground. The frost is on the fields. The trees are their pure architectural selves, stripped of everything that is not essential structure. The light comes late and leaves early, and in the middle hours of the shortest days, the sun barely seems to commit to its arc before beginning the return journey toward evening. This is the underworld time, the quiet time, the time of depth and inwardness and the long, slow processing of everything the year has given. In the ancient world, this time was also the time of the mysteries, the time for sitting by the fire and going deep into the stories, the time for the rituals that honored what was below ground, the seeds in the dark, the souls in the underworld, the roots of the trees in the frozen soil, maintaining their slow and patient breathing. Then comes the shift. Not dramatic, not a single morning when everything is different, but a gradual accumulation of small changes, the light lasting a little longer each evening, the air on a south-facing slope carrying a faint warmth in the middle of the day, the ground beginning to soften at the very edges. The crocus, that miraculous small optimist, pushing up through the last of the snow. Persephone is ascending, and by the time the meadows are in full spring flower, the narcissus and the hyacinth, the anemone and the violet, the whole glorious profusion of the season in its early perfection, she has returned. The world has received her. Demeter's love, which is the fertility of the earth, which is the growing and the blooming and the ripening of all living things, flows outward again across the fields and the orchards and the meadows. This story has been repeating for as long as there have been seasons. For as long as there has been an earth with an axis and an orbit that creates the beautiful, painful, inevitable rhythm of year after year after year. And every spring, whether you know the myth or not, you feel it. The specific gladness of that first warm day after the long cold. The specific tenderness of seeing the first green. The way the body responds before the mind has caught up. The unclenching, the opening, the breath going all the way down for the first time in months. This is Persephone, moving through you, moving through the world. She is not only in the mythology. She is in the biology. In the chemistry of the soil as it warms and the dormant seeds detect the change in temperature and begin to activate. In the physiology of the human body as it detects the lengthening light and adjusts its chemistry in response. In the specific quality of the first spring breeze, which is not merely warm air but something that carries in it the whole accumulated promise of every spring that has ever come after every winter that has ever passed. The world is full, still, of places that remember Demeter and Persephone. The ruins of Eleusis lie just outside Athens, on a low hill above the plain, the roofless remains of the great Telesterion, its stone floor still showing the marks of the columns that held the roof above the heads of the thousands who were initiated there over nearly 2 millennia. Standing among those ruins in the late afternoon, with the sun going down behind the mountains to the west and the light going golden on the old stone, it is possible to feel, not supernaturally, but in the straightforward way that places of long human devotion carry the residue of what was done there. Something quiet and significant in the air. Something that knows what the earth knows, what seeds know, what the dark knows about what it holds until it opens. In Sicily, at the great plain of Enna in the island's mountainous interior, a landscape so wild-flowered in spring that it seems to vibrate with color, tradition holds that this was the meadow of Nyssa, that this was where the narcissus stood, that this volcanic soil, rich beyond reason, impossibly fertile, brilliant with wildflowers from February onward, this was where the story began. The city of Eleusis also had a sister sanctuary at Agri, on the banks of the Ilissus River near Athens, where the lesser mysteries were held each spring, a preparation for the greater mysteries of autumn, gentler, more accessible, a first approach to what the full initiation would offer. Throughout the Greek world, there were thesmophoria sites, places where the women's festival was held each autumn, unremarkable in appearance but charged with centuries of use, of generations of women gathering on the bare ground to fast and remember and honor the cycle. Every agricultural community had its shrines at the field's edge and its seasonal rituals and its inherited knowledge, passed from mother to daughter, of when to plant and when to harvest and what to say and what to offer at the turning of the year. These places still exist, beneath whatever has been built over them. The ground remembers. The particular fertility of certain soils carries still, in some way, the long memory of being tended and honored and thanked as well as used. When you walk through a field in spring and feel the ground soft under your feet, you are walking on all of that. On all the gratitude and the reverence and the practical wisdom of all the people who planted these fields and stood in them and understood that the ground was not merely a resource but a living presence that deserved to be met with care. There is a question that the myth of Persephone invites, if you sit with it long enough. Why does the story require that she go down? Why couldn't she have remained in the spring meadows forever, gathering flowers in eternal light, without the winter, without the underworld, without the loss and the grief and the long cold dark? The answer the ancient Greeks gave in the structure of the myth itself is that such a world would be incomplete. That a world without winter is a world that doesn't know the full depth of spring. That a life without descent doesn't understand what ascent really means. Persephone becomes who she is because she goes down. Because she walks through the caverns of crystal and the asphodel meadows and the banks of the underground rivers. Because she sits with the dead and learns what they carry and what they have put down. Because she discovers in herself a depth and a gravity and a capacity for holding the hardest things that the eternal spring of her girlhood had never asked for. She returns to the surface each spring as someone who knows both worlds, who has the warmth and the flowers and the delight in sunlight and the joy of reunion with her mother, and who also carries within her the knowledge of the dark. the intimacy with endings, the understanding that everything that lives will come, eventually, to her other court. This dual knowledge, this carrying of both worlds, is what makes her one of the most quietly powerful figures in all of mythology. Not powerful in the way of Zeus, with his storms and his lightning. Not powerful in the way of Artemis, with her silver bow and her perfect aim. Powerful in the way of someone who has been all the way down and all the way back and knows exactly where the boundary is and how to move between them. She is the goddess of transitions, of the moments between one state and another, between living and dying, between winter and spring, between the girl and the woman, between the surface world and the depths. She presides over all those threshold moments with the particular authority of someone who has crossed every threshold personally. In ancient Greece, people facing the transitions of their own lives, the grief of loss, the terror of death, the long winters of personal difficulty, turned to Persephone. Not because she promised that the transition would be easy, but because she was evidence that it was possible, that descent was not the end, that the dark was not permanent, that the thing that went underground came back. Every spring, without fail, without exception, in all the centuries that human beings have watched the seasons turn, that promise has been kept. The crocuses push through the snow, the narcissus opens, the meadows fill with color, the birds return, the earth, which had been holding everything underground with such patient and determined care, opens its hands again. We have come, at last, to the place where every good story of Persephone must end. Not in the underworld, not in the bare fields of winter, not even in the moment of reunion, though that moment is full enough to end on. We end where the story always truly ends. In the meadow, a spring meadow. The light is the light of early morning in a world that has just woken up from a very long sleep. It is the particular light of March or April, depending on where in the world you are, when the angle of the sun has finally returned to something that feels personal, light that lands on your face and your hands and the tops of the grasses around you with a warmth that the winter light never quite achieved. Persephone stands in this meadow. She has been back on the surface for some weeks now, but she has not tired of it. She stands still in the middle of the meadow and lets the morning light find her. Eyes slightly closed, face tipped toward the sun. And in her expression is something that can only be described as the particular gratitude of someone who has known what it is to be without this. The meadow is alive in ways that defy description, though we will try. The grasses, still the tender early green of new growth, not yet the deep green of summer, move in the morning breeze with a sound like the softest possible music, a sibilance, a whispering of blade against blade. Among the grasses, the wildflowers are in their opening phase. Crocus mostly done now, narcissus in full glory, hyacinth sending its sweetness across the whole meadow in waves that you can almost see, almost feel on the skin. Anemones in red and white and purple, each one a small brave flag. Violets at the shadowed edges of the meadow where the trees begin. Their purple so deep and specific it looks almost like a color that shouldn't exist in the natural world. Bees move through the morning air, purposeful and unhurried, each one carrying the weight of its purpose with a thoroughness that is almost meditative. Swallows cut arcs across the blue above the treeline. Somewhere in the oak trees at the meadow's edge, a bird, a warbler perhaps, is singing with the total commitment that birds bring to spring mornings, as if the song is necessary, as if the morning requires it. A stream runs along the meadow's lower edge. It is cold still, snow melt from the mountain above, and it runs clear and fast over its smooth stones, turning to white at the small falls and settling to dark green in the deeper pools. Demeter is somewhere nearby. Persephone can feel her, the warmth of her mother's presence in the growing things all around, in the very soil beneath her feet that is soft and dark and working. The nymphs have returned. They are scattered across the meadow in the way they always were, always will be, individual and various, each drawn to their particular stream or tree or flowering corner, but always connected to each other and to the goddess at the meadow's center by something that doesn't need a name. Persephone bends down. She picks a narcissus, not that narcissus, not the one that began everything, but one of its descendants, its children's children's children, thousands of seasons removed from the original and yet carrying in its perfume the same impossible sweetness, the same quality of calling something from deep in the memory. She holds it in both hands and looks at it for a long moment. It is the most ordinary miracle. A white flower on a green stem, its 6 petals opening toward the light, its yellow center precise and certain. It has done this before, this specific flower or flowers just like it, for as long as the spring has come after the winter. It will go on doing it for as long as spring keeps coming. Persephone holds it, and in holding it, she holds everything it represents. The descent and the return, the dark and the light, the queen and the maiden, the underworld and the meadow, the winter and the spring. She holds the whole of the story she has lived, every year, for as long as anyone can remember. She holds it with both hands, and she smiles. Not a simple smile, not an uncomplicated gladness, but the smile of someone who knows what she knows, who has been where she has been, who understands in the deepest part of herself that all of this, the cold and the warmth, the loss and the return, the dark underground journey and the morning light on the meadow, all of it is part of the same story. The same whole, breathing, turning story. The earth beneath her feet is full of seeds, full of the beginnings of things that will grow through the warm months, ripen in the late summer, be harvested in the autumn. And then, when the light fails and the air turns and she descends again, they will go back into the dark earth as seeds, and wait, as seeds wait, with the profound and instinctive trust of living things that the cold will not last forever. Because it never has. Because every winter the earth has ever known has been followed by a spring. Because Persephone always comes back. She stands in the meadow for a long time, the narcissus in her hands, the morning light on her face. And gradually, as the morning deepens, she sets the flower down in the grass, gently, with intention, as if placing something in the care of the earth, and begins to walk through the meadow's flowers and the meadow's grasses and the meadow's morning light and the meadow's particular scent of rain and growth and all the accumulated sweetness of spring. The nymphs fall in around her, one by one, drawn by the same instinct that draws everything in spring toward the light. The bees continue their rounds. The stream continues its cold singing. The birds continue their necessary morning declarations. And the earth beneath it all, that dark, rich, patient, miraculous earth, continues its slow and steady breathing, in and out, through all the seasons of all the years, holding everything it is given, releasing everything at the right moment, keeping faith with the story it has always known. Sleep now. The meadow is here. Persephone is here. Spring is here. And the earth, which has always known how to hold you, holds you now. Rest. The seeds are in the dark, and they are already becoming. Rest. The world knows what to do. Rest.